So let's talk about some problem solving. We were knitting, and I don't think we put the carriage as far past the working needles as we should have. And in this one row, we ended up with this long string of yarn in the middle. And that's quite all right. This is very easy to take care of. All you'll do is you just cut it in the middle, and you'll have these two little strands of yarn on either edge of your work. That's quite all right because it's very easy to feed those edges up into the edge of the work, and no one will even see the end of the yarn. So you'll cut it, and then you'll create like a little knot here. I like to use this little latch tool to go ahead and clip to grab the yarn and pull it through and make a little knot, just like this. So an important point about working on a knitting machine is that you'll always be looking at the wrong side of the work, or the purl stitches. The right side of the work, or the knit stitches, will be facing the table. So don't be surprised when you're working, especially in some more complex projects, when it doesn't look like exactly what you have in mind. It's because it's always going to show you sort of the back side of the work. When you're pushing the carriage across the needle bed, there's no need to push it back or pull it forward or even push it across the bed and dig it in really hard. You just need to gently push it across the bed back and forth like this. If you're moving in a direction and it just stops in the middle, usually what tends to be the problem is there is a knot or something in the yarn that's keeping it from flowing smoothly to the machine. And once you get that cleared up, it'll continue moving across the bed just fine. If you ever try to go backwards with the carriage, it won't move. It always wants to move in just one direction, depending on which way you're working. So continue moving it in that original direction that you were working on. Don't try to retrace your steps. Machine knitting, as with hand knitting, the most common problem I see, it comes from the tension on the yarn. So if your ball of yarn, if the yarn is getting like tangled up in there, or it's getting tangled up in the tension unit, usually when there's a problem, that's a problem that I find. So just make sure to keep an eye on the ball of yarn to make sure it's flowing nice and smoothly out of the ball into the tension unit and then down to your machine. At the beginning of my row, it somehow created this extra little loop of yarn. Must have gotten stuck on one of the pegs. Not a big deal. I'm just going to go ahead and make a little knot here, and I'll just weave in the end when I'm done with the piece. It is important to note that when you're working on knit fabric like this, anytime you're changing colors or something happens in the yarn splits or something, you always want to knot it on the end of the work. You don't want to do it somewhere in the middle of the fabric, because if it's on the edge, you can easily weave it in and no one will notice or see it when the piece is all done. But if it's right there in the middle of your knit fabric, it's going to add like this little lumpy bit that just won't look as nice. Okay, let's talk about problem solving. So I was knitting and I had switched colors, and the yarn wasn't sitting properly in the carriage. And if the carriage moves across the bed and it doesn't have yarn in it, it's going to drop your work off of the machine. But it's okay. We can totally fix this. So this is what you do. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to remove all of the weights, because they're just going to add some more tension to the work, and that's going to cause it to want to unravel further. And then you're going to use the single transfer tool. So it's the tool with the one little loop on it, and you're just going to pick up one stitch everywhere, all the way across the bed. So remember, you were always looking at the purl side of the work. So you're going to find one of those little purl bumps, which each represent a stitch. You're going to put your single transfer tool into that little loop, and you're going to put that right back up onto the needles on the needle bed. So like I mentioned, this happened because the yarn wasn't fed properly into the carriage. And if the carriage moves across the bed without any yarn in it, so if it like runs out of yarn partway through your project, this might happen to you if you weren't paying attention to the ball of yarn. And sometimes you might want this to happen. Sometimes you might want to move the carriage across without any yarn in it and have a finished piece of knitting that has a live edge. That live edge will be something that you can unravel. So if you've ever heard of things like sock blanks, this is sort of how that works. You can create the whole long sheet of knitting and leave one end so that it can be unraveled. So I've put all the stitches back on the machine. I went one stitch beneath the row that I was working on, just because it was a little easier to see the purl bumps there. So I've just picked them up and just placed them right back up onto the needles. So now I'm going to go through and make sure that I have all the stitches on the same row of knitting. So since I tried to select this second row, the row beneath the one that had fallen off the machine, I should be able to take this yarn here and just pull it off of the hooks all the way down the bed. And as I do this, if I find a stitch that is one above or below, I can go ahead and manipulate that at that time to get it just so it's at the same row as the rest of the stitches. So don't be upset if you've knit like 400 rows and then your piece falls off the machine. It's okay. It takes a couple of minutes, but you can put your work back on the machine and get back to working with it. So there we go. We've done it. All of these stitches are back on the needle bed and they're all on the same row of stitches. So we are ready to reattach our yarn and continue knitting. So with machine knitting, just like hand knitting, sometimes you're going to drop a stitch and you'll look at your hook and you'll see that the stitch has fallen. And it starts, you've dropped the stitch and it started running down the column of stitches. So if you've noticed this early enough and you can see that it just happened a couple rows beneath, then you're just going to want to use your little latch tool and feed the stitch back up those ladder stitches and then get it back onto the hook. So this is very similar to how you would fix a drop stitch if you were hand knitting. The only thing to remember is that you're looking at the wrong side of the work, not the right side of the work. So as you pull that stitch back up, you need to make a bunch of purl stitches, not knit stitches. So go to the bottom stitch that you can find, pull it past the latch on the hook, then you use the hook to grab the next rung of the ladder just above it. You're going to pull that rung through that first stitch. Now you're going to extend your hook out so that the stitch that's currently on the hook falls past the latch. Take the hook and latch onto the next top rung of the ladder, and then you're going to pull that rung of the ladder. By pulling the latch hook towards you, you're going to be pulling that next rung of the ladder, which is in the hook, through the loop that is past the latch. So it's just you're feeding it up the ladder. Now you just take that last stitch and you put it right back onto the hook on the needle bed. So this is where we had our issue, but you can see now we have everybody back where they need to be, and it's not a problem. We fixed it. Now sometimes you're going to drop a stitch and you won't even realize it, because as long as all your needles are pulled out to working position, the carriage is going to knit them. So if at some point it missed a needle for some reason, and then it's continued going on, it might be continuing to knit that stitch. And then you're working on your piece and then you notice that a stitch was missed significantly further down in your work. In that case, what I'd like to do is I will take a stitch marker, or if you don't have a stitch marker, you can even use a paper clip, and I will just find the loop of that stitch where that hole is, and I will secure it so it won't run down any further and create a bigger hole. Then when my entire project is complete and off of the knitting machine, then I will mend that little hole. What I tend to do in that case, since it is in the middle of the work, I'm going to have to work on it carefully. What I'll do is I'll take a string of the same yarn and I will unply it a little bit so it's a little bit thinner. And then I will gently weave in around that stitch to secure it in place. Because I've thinned down the yarn a little bit, it doesn't create as bulky section as it would if I had used the full width of the yarn. Another thing I want to point out is that you can always transfer your knitting off of the machine. So if you want to create a project that is part knitted on the machine and part knitted on knitting needles, you can certainly do that. If you ran out of time and you need to go, but you need to get the piece off the machine, you can use circular needles like these, and you can just feed off each stitch across the bed onto the knitting needles. Or you could even use, if you had like a coat hanger, that's kind of nice because it's a nice rigid material, so it's kind of nice to use. You could, if you wanted to, just use a fat needle with a contrast color piece of yarn and transfer all those stitches onto that length of the contrast color yarn. And then you can either knit on it on your own at home with knitting needles, Or you can come back and put each of those stitches back onto the machine and continue working on your project. So here I'm taking the tip of my knitting needle and I've put it through the first stitch. And now that it's in, now I'm going to pull the needle out on the bed until the latch is past the stitch. And now I'm going to push it back towards the machine, and that's going to close the latch and transfer the stitch off of the needle that's on the knitting machine bed. And now the stitch will live on the knitting needle.